Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Annette Young. If there's one thing that Donald Trump has done, and that is to galvanise the women's movement in America, the 45th president's incendiary comments about women and his divisive policies on reproductive rights have in fact given a new lease of life to feminism. But American historian Marjorie Spruill will tell you that the nation's polarisation is no recent trend. In fact, as she explains in her latest book on the US battle for women's rights, Divided We Stand, it goes back some 40 years and is directly linked to the women's movement. Marjorie Spruill joins me in the studio today. Marjorie, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
I just want to ask you, where were you at in terms of writing this book when Donald Trump was voted into power?
I was very close to the end. In fact, I had already turned in the epilogue that traced the story from 1980 up through the 2016, up to the 2016 election, so I had to revise it.
I imagine for you, given what you've written, that his victory came as a bit of a shock.
It did come as a big shock, but of course it came as a big shock to everyone else as well.
Just explain to me, though, in terms of as you're there writing the very end of this book, what impact did it have on what you'd written and what you had discovered in the process of researching and writing this book?
It's a good story because all summer I was writing the epilogue. Bloomsbury, my publisher, had asked me to take it all the way up to the present, and I was distressed that I was going to have to end before the election. And I ended up with several endings, one in which Hillary was surging and it looked like there was going to be a sweep, possibly even of the Senate. This is what was being said. And then the one where he had Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon, and Kellyanne Conway helped persuade lots of women to vote for him. And then at the end, we ended up delaying going to press. And so I was able to have a whole morning to totally revise the end to incorporate the results.
Just a morning?
Just a morning.
This despite having spent months, if not years, on researching this book.
More than a dozen years.
America is, as far as we see it from the outside, is a very highly polarised country at this point in time. But as your book reveals, this is something that's been a long time coming and in fact goes all the way back to a rather pivotal event in 1977 in Houston, Texas, where the National Women's Conference took place. Yes. Under the steerage of Gloria Steinem and others. Just give me a bit of sense about the importance of that event.
Yes, I feel that it was a real turning point in American history, which is quite amazing, seeing as how few people even know about it. But it was an event in which feminists who had been basically empowered by the federal government in the early 70s, and they were able to have this conference. Gerald Ford had appointed a feminist Republican to lead the Commission on International Women's Year.
I just want to stop you there because the words a feminist Republican is somewhat hard to believe today in 2017.
Well, one of the stories, if people would like to read the book, is that in the early part of the 70s, both parties were supporting feminist ideas. The polls showed strong support for the women's movement. Conservative women, who are a huge part of the book, had not yet begun to organize. And so all three branches of the federal government were implementing changes that were in accordance with feminist goals. Even Richard Nixon, who Bella Abzug famously called America's #1 chauvinist pig, was supporting women's rights.
But that all changed in 1977 because what happened was at this event with Gloria Steinem, we saw the emergence of effectively a conservative women's movement, if you like, who set up a protest at the other end of town, didn't they?
And that was organised by a woman named Lottie Best Hobbs, who was from Texas, who was a Church of Christ leader, who really famous. She's very little people know about her, but she's the one who helped Phyllis Schlafly recruit large numbers of evangelical Protestants and fundamentalists into the anti-ERA and the anti-feminist movement that began to be called the ProFamily movement during that year.
So how did we get from that 40 years ago to now, where it seems that women's rights or most importantly, reproductive rights, are the core issue that truly divides your country.
Yes, and what happened is that after that conference, this group of conservative women who had been empowered remained politically active and persuaded the Republican Party to stop its 40-year support for the Equal Rights Amendment, to present itself as the party of family values, to take a very strong pro-life position, and that basically meant that the two parties had chosen up sides between the women's rights movement and the conservative women's movement, and it's remained like that ever since.
Do people recognise that event for the extraordinary consequences that resulted from it?
Most Americans have not heard about it. At the time, it was a media extravaganza. Every major journalist in the country, all of the networks, and PBS broadcast constantly from there. But people seem to have forgotten it, which is really quite amazing. Every important woman in America, whether she was in politics or sports, like Billie Jean King, Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, Maya Angelou, were there and proud to be associated with this feminist-run event. All three First Ladies were there, and yet people don't know much about it at all now.
Because the irony is, it was that protest at the other end of the town which ended up having a much greater impact on the political stage.
Well, I argue that both sides were, the feminist and the conservative women, were mobilized heavily by this. It was really a big boon to the feminist movement. It got much stronger as a result of this conference.
Marjorie, just explain to me, though, I mean, how it is from that event 40 years ago. And I want to talk about the fact that, you know, there was that protest rally that was occurring, which was led by effectively the beginning of a family or pro-family movement, how that went on to impact politics to the point that we now have a situation that we're facing in 2017 in America.
Yeah, well, I believe that when women began to demand more of a role in politics, and when both feminist and conservative women were pushing women's issues to the forefront of American politics, that, in other words, as the personal became political, that politics changed in America. And you have a situation in which issues that are just loaded with religious and moral significance are now at the top of the political agenda. And then when you have the two parties choosing up sides, then what happened is that our politics became much more polarized. People had a tendency to demonize the other side. The whole concept of compromise, which politicians used to be praised for, kind of went out the window, as did the idea of moderation. Constituents would not tolerate moderation and compromise as much, and we still have a situation in which issues like abortion, for instance, are considered to be so vital to both sides that they tend to not see any way to compromise on that issue.
Here we have now a 45th president who was voted in by a large slice of people who support the pro-life movement, and also, surprisingly, by a sizable chunk of white women.
Yes, but see, I may be one of the few people in America who follow politics who doesn't seem to be surprised by that.
Why is that?
Because I've known for a long time that there was a strong and powerful conservative women's movement, and that women are deeply divided over politics. And the issues about which women have been divided since the 1970s are the ones that divide the country now.
I just want to ask you, as much as Donald Trump seems to be capitalising on a highly divided country, could this indeed backfire? And could we actually see what we saw, for instance, with the Women's March and the fact that we now have an emboldened women's movement in America, that, you know, there could be a genuine attempt to sort of heal these divisions as such and reach some point of unity? Do you think that is at all possible?
I think that there's a real possibility for, I believe we already have, a greatly strengthened women's rights movement, and that the younger women who had basically been taking the feminist victories for granted and feeling as though these battles had been fought and won are now awakened to the fact that they are going to have to really work to keep them.
Given your historical background, though, where do you see America heading at this point?
I don't know. As a historian, I'm better at telling you what happened than what's about to happen. But
history does tend to repeat itself, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But the American politics in recent years has been so full of surprises and constant change, with a president who changes his mind constantly. There's really no telling. But I definitely do believe that the women's movement is stronger than it's been in quite a while, and that it's going to be a very powerful factor in the future of American politics.
So for those who support gender equality, don't lose hope yet.
Oh, no.
Marjorie Spruill, it's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much. And that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Do stay with us because there'll be more news and headlines coming up very shortly.